Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are jumping right into the origin story of modern India. We're going back to the decades right after 1858, a really fascinating time of huge change where these scattered whispers of discontent started to come together into one single, powerful national voice. This is the story of how a subcontinent really began to see itself as a nation.
All right, let's start with this quote because it just says it all. It's from Surendranath Banerjee, one of the key early nationalist leaders. At first, he saw the British Empire as, this protective force, a banyan tree. But then, something shifted. He later said that very same tree now shelters only serpents. I mean, wow. That's not just a clever turn of phrase. It's the perfect snapshot of the massive disillusionment that was sweeping across India.
So what on earth happened? How did you get from this idea of a protective shelter to a nest of poisonous snakes? Well, the answer isn't just one single event. It was a whole series of policies, a whole attitude, really, that planted these deep, deep seeds of discontent all across the Indian landscape.
And a huge catalyst for this was one man, Viceroy Lord Lytton. I mean, look at this list. In just a few years, he managed to tick off pretty much all the educated Indians. First, he lowered the age for the super prestigious civil service exam, which basically slammed the door shut for most Indians. Then, while a terrible famine was raging, he throws this incredibly lavish party, the Delhi Durbar. The optics were just awful. Then he gags the Indian language press and takes away the right for Indians to have arms. Put it all together, and the message was crystal clear. You are second-class citizens in your own country.
But people weren't just going to sit there and take it, right? This growing anger, I started to get organized. Long before the Indian National Congress was a name everyone knew, political awareness was just bubbling up all over the place. These local groups, started by educated Indians, began to take all those individual complaints and channel them into actual, formal demands for change.
And you can literally see the momentum building right here on this timeline. This wasn't happening overnight. As far back as 1851, you had the British Indian Association in Calcutta petitioning for reforms. Then in 1866, the amazing Dadabhai Naoroji takes the fight right to the heart of the empire, starting the East India Association in London to try and shape British public opinion. The pace really picks up in 1876 with Surendranath Banerjee's Indian Association, which was way more than just a debating club. It actively campaigned on real issues. And by 1884, with the Madras Mahajan Sabha in the South, you can see it's all starting to connect. A real national network was beginning to take shape.
So all of this organizing, all of this rising consciousness, it had to lead somewhere. It became obvious that what was needed was one single all-India platform, a place where leaders from every part of the country could come together, could strategize, and could speak with one voice. And this all led to that historic moment in 1885, the founding of the Indian National Congress.
But this is where the story gets really, really interesting and a little complicated. Because the guy who was instrumental in getting everyone in the same room wasn't an Indian. He was a retired British civil servant named Alan Octavian Hume. And his involvement has sparked this debate that's lasted for over a century. Was the Congress a genuine Indian movement, or was it just a clever British trick to control the narrative? And this slide breaks down the two big theories perfectly. First, you have the safety valve theory. The idea here is that the British were getting nervous, and they figured it was better to create a safe, controlled organization where Indians could vent their frustrations, let off some steam, rather than letting it build up into another huge rebellion. On the other side is the lightning conductor theory. This one argues that the Indian leaders were actually the clever ones here. They used Hume. They knew that if they started a radical organization on their own, the British would probably just crush it immediately. So by having a British guy as a sort of figurehead, he acted like a lightning conductor, drawing the fire and protecting the new organization while it found its feet. Honestly, most historians today think the truth is somewhere in the middle, but it's a fascinating debate.
But whatever its true origin, the result was a huge deal. December 1885, Bombay. 72 delegates get together for the very first session of the Indian National Congress. Now, the crucial thing to understand about this first meeting is the tone. These guys, mostly well-educated professionals like lawyers, they weren't showing up and shouting for independence. Not at all. They actually pledged loyalty to the British Crown. But, and this is a big but, they attached a clear set of demands for more Indian representation and a bunch of administrative reforms. The long journey had officially begun.
So for the next 20 years, from about 1885 to 1905, the Congress was really run by a group of leaders we now call the moderates. Think of guys like Dadabhai Naoroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and Shah Mehta. These weren't firebrand revolutionaries, they were constitutionalists. They believed in making change happen slowly, from within the system, and they had a very specific game plan for how to do it.
And their whole method is often boiled down to the 3 Ps. First, petition. They would write up these incredibly detailed resolutions and petitions outlining exactly what they wanted, things like holding the civil service exams in India, not just London, and giving Indians more seats on legislative councils. Second, prayer. Now let's be clear, this isn't religious prayer. It's more like a deep, heartfelt appeal. They genuinely believed that the British people were fair and just, and if they could just present their case logically and reasonably, the British would eventually do the right thing. And third, propaganda. They used newspapers, pamphlets, and public meetings to educate their fellow Indians about politics and to build a strong, unified public opinion that would back up their demands.
But the most powerful weapon in their arsenal wasn't about politics at all. It was about economics, and nobody made this case better than Dadabhai Naoroji. In 1892, he makes history as the first Indian ever elected to the British Parliament. And from that incredible platform, he looks them in the eye and delivers this devastating line. He wasn't just being emotional. He had the receipts. He had a whole economic takedown ready to go.
And that takedown became known as the drain of wealth theory. This was an absolute game changer. Naoroji and other economists painstakingly detailed how British rule wasn't this great gift to India. They showed, with data, how wealth was just being systematically siphoned from India to Britain. Through massive salaries for British officials, huge profits for British companies, paying for military campaigns that had nothing to do with India, it was an intellectual bombshell. It completely dismantled the whole myth of the benevolent empire and proved that British rule was at its core an economic extraction machine. This theory gave Indian nationalism its powerful, fact-based argument.
And while all this was happening, it is so important to remember that women were part of this political awakening from the get-go. People like Kadambini Ganguly and Anandibai Joshi, these women were absolute trailblazers. They were 2 of India's first female doctors. And just by showing up to these political meetings, they were making a huge statement. They were breaking down all sorts of barriers and really marking the start of women's long and crucial role in the national movement.
But here's the thing about the moderate strategy. It was slow, painfully slow. They did the vital work of building the foundation, but the British weren't exactly rushing to hand over power. This lack of any real substantial reform led to this growing feeling of impatience, of frustration. A younger generation was starting to pop up, and they were beginning to ask, is politely asking our rulers for justice really the best way to go about this?
To really get this frustration, just look at the moderates' biggest supposed victory, the Indian Councils Act of 1892. Okay, on paper, it looked like a win. It made the legislative councils bigger, introduced a sort of indirect election system. But in reality, the power they got was tiny. The councils couldn't pass laws, they couldn't control the budget, they could basically just offer advice. Advice that the British could, and often did, completely ignore. Imagine you ask for a voice, and what you get is a microphone that isn't even plugged in. That's what this felt like. It was seen as a token gesture, and this failure just poured gasoline on the fire of this new, more radical group growing inside the Congress.
Okay, and this chart just lays out the massive split in thinking perfectly. On one side, you have the moderates. Their goal? Reforms, but within the British Empire. Then you look at the extremists, leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Lala Lajpat Rai. Their goal? Swaraj, self-rule. Their methods were also worlds apart. Forget petitions. The extremists were talking about boycotts, passive resistance, direct action. And their inspiration wasn't Western liberal philosophy. They looked inward, to Indian history, culture, and religion for their strength. The divide was huge. And it was really a perfect storm of events that brought this new, more aggressive phase to a boil. First, the drain of wealth theory, the moderates' own idea, proved the economic damage of British rule. Then, a series of horrible famines and plagues hit, and the British government's response was seen as totally inadequate, which destroyed a lot of trust. You get another viceroy, Lord Curzon, who was just as repressive as Lytton. Then, something happens on the world stage that changes everything. In 1905, Japan, an Asian nation, defeats Russia, a European giant, in a war. This sent shockwaves everywhere. The myth of European invincibility was shattered. But the final spark, the one that lit the whole fire, was Curzon's decision in 1905 to partition Bengal. This was seen as a blatant move to divide and rule and break the spirit of Indian nationalism.
And so, by 1905, the first chapter of India's freedom struggle was really coming to a close. The moderates, they had done the essential, foundational work. They created a national platform. They developed this powerful critique of colonialism. They had awakened a nation's political consciousness. But their methods, well, they just didn't seem to be enough anymore. The era of polite petitions was over. The question hanging in the air was, what comes next? The stage was now set for a brand new, much more confrontational, and much more turbulent chapter in the fight for freedom.